This is my true story. I was a father who built my son's life with my bare hands. I worked long hours, skipped meals, and gave him everything I never had. I believed love meant sacrifice. But one night, that belief was crushed. In front of his friends, he pushed me to the floor and laughed while I lay there. My heart didn't just break, it froze. I didn't rise in anger. I rose in silence, and what I did next made him kneel where I once fell. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent my whole life building his world. Every morning began with work, and every night ended with worry. I fixed his broken toys when he was small, repaired his bike when he fell, paid for every book and every meal. My back bent under years of labor, but I never complained. I thought love meant never stopping, never resting, never saying no. He grew in comfort while I carried struggle on my shoulders. I stood in the rain for wages, skipped food so he could eat, and smiled even when my hands bled. I wanted him to have more than I ever did. When he was young, I believed his laughter was my reward. Each time he called me father, the pain of the day disappeared. I thought kindness would grow gratitude in him, that he would understand effort when he became a man. But comfort blinds people. He grew used to warmth without seeing the fire that kept it burning. Every bill I paid, every debt I cleared, every door I opened became invisible to him. The world gave him applause for his success, but I knew the stage had been built with my sweat. As the years passed, he forgot the meaning of effort. He spoke like a man who had built his own success, never mentioning the hands that pushed him upward. When I got older, my strength began to fade. I thought he would step forward and carry some of the weight. Instead, he stepped back. I saw it in his eyes, the quiet irritation when I moved slower, the distance in his tone when I asked for help. He had outgrown not just my roof, but my worth. I gave him everything I could until my savings thinned and my body grew weak. Even then, I continued. I paid for his rent when he struggled, covered his debts, and smiled when he called me generous. He didn't see the truth, that generosity had replaced respect. Each favor made me smaller in his eyes. I thought helping him meant holding the family together. It only taught him that I was there to serve. He grew proud. He started talking about how he never needed anyone, not realizing every comfort around him was still tied to my name. He brought his friends into my house and acted like it was his. He dismissed my words as if wisdom ended with age. I stayed quiet because arguing would only make me look old. I believed that silence was love. It wasn't. It was surrender. Every father hopes that his sacrifices will be remembered. Mine were not. He lived his life in the ease I built, and I lived mine in the shadow of what I gave. When I looked at him, I saw flashes of the boy I raised, the one who used to hold my hand crossing the street. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man shaped by comfort, hardened by pride, blind to gratitude. I kept waiting for a moment, a word, a sign that the respect I planted would grow again. It never came. Then one night, that respect broke completely. The same hands that once clung to my shoulders in fear would soon push me to the ground in anger. I had carried him for years, through hunger, illness, and debt. I never thought the day would come when those hands would rise against me. But life has a way of showing truth in the hardest way. I looked back on all the years I gave and realized something simple. Love without limits teaches people that limits don't exist. I had built a man who believed I would always forgive, always stay silent, always bear his weight. I thought I was building a son. I had built an entitled stranger, and soon that stranger would cross a line that could never be undone. It happened on a quiet evening that began like any other. The air outside was still, but inside the house, something dark was waiting to happen. He had his friends over. Loud voices, music, laughter. I didn't mind. I was used to noise. I had lived through storms louder than that. But then the talk turned to money, and everything changed. He wanted more, even though I had already given more than enough. My savings were running low, and I told him I couldn't help this time. The words were calm, but they carried truth he didn't want to hear. Pride, hates truth. His face changed, and the laughter in the room stopped. He stepped closer, full of anger that came from years of never being told no. I could see it in his eyes, not pain, not confusion, but power. Power over me, the man who had built everything he stood on. Then it happened. His hands pushed against me, hard, with no hesitation. My body fell backward before my mind could catch up. The floor hit my back, cold and rough, and for a moment the air left my lungs. The sound echoed through the room, louder than the laughter that followed. My son, my own blood, stood above me while his friends looked on. They didn't help me up, they laughed. The sound burned worse than the pain. I looked at him from the floor, and for the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger who wore his face, a man with no respect, no heart, no memory of everything I had done to build him. My hands trembled, not from age, but from disbelief. I had lived long enough to see the world change, but I never imagined it would turn this way inside my own home. I stayed on the floor longer than I should have. The world around me blurred, my back hurt, my knees shook, but my heart was what truly broke. I wasn't crying. There were no tears left, just silence. Deep, thick, endless silence that filled every corner of the room. His laughter faded into background noise, something far away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was empty. It was as if a switch had flipped inside me, turning off everything that once made me soft. I stood up slowly, using the wall for balance. My body was weak, but my mind had never been clearer. I looked around the room, the walls I had painted, the furniture I had bought, the floor I had repaired. Everything in that house carried my fingerprints. Yet I was the one being laughed at on it. The irony didn't hurt anymore. It only opened my eyes wider. He had mistaken patience for weakness. He had mistaken love for servitude. And that mistake would cost him everything he took for granted. That night, I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I just walked out of the room quietly while they kept laughing, too blind to notice that something permanent had changed. They thought they had won, that an old man had been put in his place. They didn't understand that every empire built on arrogance falls without warning. I had spent years building his comfort, and with one decision, I could take it away. When I reached my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They were bruised, but steady. These were the same hands that had lifted him when he was sick, the same hands that had worked so he could live well. Now, they had become the hands that would write his ending. I didn't feel pain anymore. I felt purpose. He thought that push made me smaller. He didn't realize it made me stronger. When I hit that floor, I left behind the part of me that begged for respect. I rose with something new, a calm, deliberate will. The man who pushed me would soon learn what it feels like to kneel. The next day, the street knew before the sun rose. Neighbors whispered at their gates, their eyes heavy with curiosity. Word had already spread, the old man pushed to the floor by his own son. In a world that forgets fast, cruelty travels the fastest. Some had seen it with their own eyes. Others had seen the video his friends recorded. I had not realized someone had filmed it. My fall had become entertainment. A moment of humiliation turned into laughter for people who once respected me. I was not just a father betrayed. I was now a story told behind hands and smirks. When I stepped outside to buy bread that morning, I felt the weight of their looks. No one spoke, but silence has its own language. Heads turned, eyes followed, lips moved quietly. Some pitied me, some judged me, and others enjoyed the gossip. The respect that took a lifetime to earn had been erased overnight by one act of violence and one careless video. My name, once spoken with pride, now carried shame. I felt it in the way people looked away, in the way children were told not to stare. Back home, I sat on my small bench and stared at the ground. The laughter from the night before still echoed in my head. I could see their faces clearly. My son standing tall, his friends laughing, my body on the floor. It replayed in silence again and again. It wasn't the pain of the fall that stayed with me. It was the image of him, smiling. That smile broke something that would never heal. I had raised a man who found joy in his father's pain. There is no greater failure than that. The humiliation went beyond the walls of our home. At the market, people avoided my eyes. Some greeted me with false kindness, their voices soft with pity. Others pretended not to see me at all. I didn't blame them. The world is quick to watch and slow to care. They saw an old man broken by the child he built, and they found comfort in knowing it wasn't their story. But deep inside, I knew. Someday, every disrespect finds its return. He, on the other hand, carried himself proudly. He walked the street as if nothing had happened. His arrogance had grown taller than the buildings around us. The same people who whispered about him still smiled to his face. Some even praised his success. That's how the world works. It claps for cruelty when money and pride hide the truth. But pride doesn't last. It only waits for its turn to fall. That day, I didn't speak a word to him. I didn't confront or plead. I moved through my house like a ghost, silent and unseen. Every object I touched reminded me of how much I had given him. The table, the chair, the clock on the wall, all paid for with my hands. Yet none of it belonged to me anymore. My own home had become a stage for my humiliation. I sat quietly, listening to the sound of his laughter outside. I let it fill the air, not because I was weak, but because I had begun to understand. The louder a man laughs at his father, the closer he is to losing everything. That night, I didn't sleep. The image of my fall kept flashing in my mind like lightning that refused to fade. But under that pain, a plan began to take shape. I realized that sometimes life doesn't let you rise until you hit the ground. That fall was my beginning, not my end. The same people who whispered about me would one day whisper about him, not because of revenge, but because truth always returns home. The shame he gave me became my strength. The humiliation became my weapon. I decided that I would not raise my voice or my hand. I would raise the very papers that built his comfort. He had turned my fall into laughter. I would turn his laughter into silence. That night, I sat alone in my room. The house was silent, but my thoughts were clear. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly in my ears, but I didn't let anger take over. I had learned that noise only feeds pride. What I needed was calm enough to see the truth and act with precision. I walked to the drawer where I kept old documents. Dust had gathered on the edges, untouched for years. I opened it slowly and began to go through the papers one by one. Each page carried a memory, the years of work, the house I built, the loans I cleared, the savings I hid for emergencies. Everything that had built our family's comfort was written there in black and white. Among the papers, I found what I was looking for, the mortgage documents. My name was written at the top in bold letters. I read every line carefully, reminding myself of what I owned and what he didn't. The house he lived in was not his. It was mine, built with my hands, paid for with my years. He had forgotten that the roof above him still belonged to me. I turned the page and found another document, an old bank book, one he never knew existed. The balance wasn't large, but it was enough to make a difference, enough to start something quietly powerful. I sat back and stared at the papers laid out before me. They looked ordinary, but they carried strength far greater than anger or revenge. These papers were my voice, silent, factual, undeniable. They didn't shout or argue. They spoke through truth, through ownership, through law. My son had laughed when he pushed me down, thinking I had nothing left. But he didn't understand that real power often hides in quiet places. It doesn't show off. It waits. The room around me was dark, but the papers caught the light from the small lamp on the table. I could see my name shining faintly under the glow. It was the same name he had once mocked, the same name that had opened every door in his life. He had lived too long under the illusion that he was in control. Now he would learn that the foundation beneath his comfort was still held by me. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, reading, thinking, remembering. The more I looked at the papers, the more I realized how much I had allowed him to take from me, not just money, but peace, pride, and dignity. I had handed over everything without question, believing that love made it right. But love without respect is an empty exchange. These papers were not revenge, they were correction. They reminded me that I still had the right to set things right. I closed the drawer gently after putting everything back in order. My mind was calm, not restless. I didn't want to fight him. I didn't want to see him suffer. I wanted him to learn, to feel what humility feels like. The same humility I had felt when I hit that floor. There are lessons that words cannot teach, lessons that only consequence can. And I was ready to let consequence do its work. That night I slept for the first time in days. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had found direction. The man he pushed wasn't weak. He was patient. The papers were proof of that patience. They were waiting for the moment to speak, and soon they would. When I closed my eyes, I thought of the years I had spent carrying his weight, and I felt a strange peace. I didn't need revenge. I needed balance. And in those quiet hours, with the documents resting safely where they belonged, I knew balance was already on its way. Morning came with gray light through the window. The city outside was busy as always, but inside my house, the world felt still. The papers from the night before were spread across the table. I looked at them again, each line, each number, each signature, proof of everything I had built and everything he had forgotten. My heart was steady. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I didn't feel rage either. What I felt was a quiet strength that comes when a man has nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. The time for patience had ended. The time for action had begun. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. He had known me for many years, seen me through struggles, seen the sacrifices I made for family. He listened quietly as I told him what I wanted done. I spoke slowly, clearly, without emotion. There was no need for explanation, no need for long stories. The decision was already made. I told him to begin the process immediately, to change ownership, to move accounts, to secure everything under my control. Every property, every legal tie that carried my name, I wanted reviewed. I had protected my son for too long. Now I would protect myself. The lawyer agreed and said he would prepare everything by the afternoon. When I hung up, I didn't move from my chair. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. I had taken the first step toward balance. I realized that revenge is not about hate. It's about truth correcting its course. My son had built his pride on my patience, his comfort on my kindness, his strength on my silence. Now that silence was gone. The world would soon show him who really held the power. I stood up and walked to the mirror. The reflection looking back was older, lined with years of labor and loss, but the eyes were alive again. For the first time in a long while, I saw the same man who had once built everything from nothing. The same man who had carried bricks, saved coins, and never gave up. He was not weak. He had only forgotten how to act. Now he remembered. The man who was pushed down had risen again, not with fists, but with wisdom. By noon, the lawyer called back. The paperwork had been started. The changes were official, the documents sealed, and the notices prepared. Every action had weight. Every line of text carried consequence. He explained that once the notices were sent, the ownership would transfer and the locks could legally be changed. Everything I had once handed to my son was coming back to my name. I thanked him and hung up. My hands were steady as I placed the phone down. There was no turning back. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning my house. Each small movement felt like cleansing years of disappointment. I didn't hum or smile. I simply worked. The rhythm of sweeping, folding, and sorting reminded me that peace doesn't come from anger. It comes from order. I had allowed chaos to live in my home for too long. Now I was reclaiming it, one quiet act at a time. When evening came, I lit a small lamp and sat again at the table. The light flickered softly over the papers, making the ink gleam. The decision was cold, but it was fair. I hadn't taken anything that wasn't mine. I had only taken back what I gave to someone who no longer deserved it. The world has laws for property, But life has laws for respect. Both had now been restored. That night, as the sky darkened, I didn't feel the weight of guilt. I felt light, lighter than I had in years. I understood something simple but powerful. When kindness becomes invisible, consequence must become visible. My decision wasn't cruel. It was necessary. And soon, he would understand that the floor he made me touch was the same ground he stood on, and it no longer belonged to him. The next morning arrived clear and quiet. I woke before the sun and sat by the window, listening to the faint sounds of the street. The air felt different, clean, sharp, free. I didn't rush. I didn't plan. Everything was already in motion. The lawyer had done his part, the papers were sealed, and now the world would deliver the message I no longer needed to speak. I drank my tea slowly, watching the light grow stronger through the curtains. It was the calm before a storm, but not a storm of destruction, a storm of justice. While he was still asleep in his house, movers arrived with instructions in hand. Their steps were steady, their work quiet. They carried boxes, furniture, and clothes, all of it leaving under the eyes of the same neighbors who once whispered about me. The locks on the doors were changed, notices were pinned to the wall. Official letters lay neatly on the table, carrying words that no shouting could erase. Every sound in that house echoed finality. The roof he once bragged about now belonged to no one but the truth. He came home later that day to confusion. The gate didn't open, the key didn't fit. What he once called his home had turned cold and unreachable. His friends stood nearby, watching. The same people who once laughed with him stayed quiet. Pride is loud in comfort, but it dies in silence. He read the notice, line by line, his face changing as the meaning sank in. The laughter that had once filled the house had no place there anymore. It was replaced by the sound of reality, paper rustling, locks clicking, pride collapsing. He tried to fight it, of course. Calls were made, arguments thrown, but none of it mattered. The law does not bend for arrogance. The lawyer handled everything with precision. Each document carried authority that words could not challenge. My son's voice, once filled with mockery, had become a tremor of disbelief. He had built his pride on borrowed ground, and the foundation had vanished. Meanwhile, I sat on my porch miles away, the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. I didn't smile, but a quiet peace lived behind my stillness. I had not lifted a hand against him. I had not shouted or cursed. I had simply let the truth speak in its own language, a language written in ink, signed in law, and sealed with dignity. The world was correcting itself, one silent page at a time. By evening, the neighbors around his house had begun to whisper again. This time, it wasn't about me. It was about him, the proud son who mocked his father and lost everything overnight. They watched as his things were carried out and placed by the street. They watched his pride drain away, not through punishment, but through realization. The man who once stood tall had nowhere left to stand. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I imagined him sitting outside that locked door, surrounded by boxes, wondering how everything had changed so fast. He would remember the laughter, the push, the fall, and realize that every action has a shadow. That shadow had finally caught up with him. His arrogance had found its silence. I sat at home with my lamp burning low, the same papers folded neatly beside me. I didn't need to see him beg. I didn't need to hear his apology. The lesson was already alive in his eyes, in the emptiness around him, in the cold truth of what was gone. My victory wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The house that had witnessed my humiliation now stood as a monument to consequence. When night came, I closed my eyes and rested. I didn't dream of revenge or regret. I dreamed of peace, the kind of peace that only comes when you've faced humiliation, stood back up, and let the world restore balance. The execution was complete, and I didn't have to lift a single finger. The same hands that once pushed me had now met the ground. After the papers were signed and the locks were changed, the world grew silent again. I spent the next morning on my small porch with a cup of tea. The sun rose slowly, painting everything in gold, but my mind stayed still. I didn't feel pride, I didn't feel excitement. I only felt peace, the kind that comes when a storm has passed. My hands rested on the arm of the chair, steady and calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for trouble. I was waiting for truth to finish its work. The street was quiet except for the sound of birds. I watched the leaves move gently in the wind, their rhythm soft and slow. My body was old, but my heart felt young again, not from joy, but from freedom. The weight that had pressed on me for so long had finally lifted. I didn't carry shame anymore. The whispers had stopped. The neighbors who once pitied me now looked at me with quiet respect. They had seen what patience can do when it decides to stand. I didn't check my phone. I knew the calls would come, calls filled with anger, confusion, maybe even tears. But I wasn't curious. I had learned that some words are better left unheard. When you answer pain with silence, it starts to echo back to the one who caused it. That echo is stronger than any argument. It reaches deeper than any insult. I let that silence work for me. The day passed slowly, but time didn't matter anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology, only for the moment when understanding would finally reach him. I knew it would come. Maybe not that day, maybe not that week, but soon. Pride always bends under the weight of truth. I had no anger left, only patience. The same patience that once made me weak had now become my strength. As the afternoon light faded, I thought about everything that had happened. The push, the laughter, the humiliation, all of it had once felt unbearable. But now, when I looked back, it felt distant, almost unreal. Pain loses its power when you learn from it. I realized that sometimes the best revenge is not pain for pain, but peace after chaos. My peace had become his mirror. Every quiet breath I took would remind him of what he lost. The air cooled as evening arrived. I could hear children playing somewhere far away, their laughter carrying through the wind. It didn't hurt to hear it anymore. It reminded me of the boy my son used to be, innocent, kind, full of wonder. Somewhere along the way, he had traded that boy for a man built from pride. But now, he would have to face himself without the walls that kept him proud. Life was teaching him in a way I never could. I went inside as the sky turned orange. The tea on the table had gone cold, but I left it there. I didn't need warmth in the cup. I had found it inside me. The walls of my house no longer felt heavy with sadness. They held peace. Everything was simple again. One bed, one chair, one man, and his silence. That was enough. Before sleeping, I looked once more at the old papers resting on my table. They had done their part. I didn't need to touch them again. I smiled faintly, not out of victory, but out of understanding. I had finally learned what power really was. Not the power to control others, but the power to stop giving them control over you. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the quiet outside. No laughter, no noise, only the slow rhythm of life moving forward. I didn't know when he would come, but I knew he would. Pride breaks faster than people think. And when it does, silence is the only place left to run. I closed my eyes and waited. Not for revenge, but for repentance. The wait was calm. The night was long, and peace sat beside me like an old friend. The rain started in the afternoon, soft at first, then steady. I sat by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. The world outside was gray, but inside I felt calm. The silence I had carried for days had done its work. I didn't expect him to come, but I knew he would. Pride can hold a man upright for a while, but not forever. When everything around him falls, the same pride that once made him cruel turns into desperation. I didn't move from my chair. I waited, still and patient, while the sound of rain filled the air. Hours passed before I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. It was broken, uneven, like someone unsure if they should even be there. I didn't rush to the door. I walked slowly, each step measured, each breath steady. When I opened it, the rain blew in, cold and sharp. He stood there, drenched, The same man who once pushed me now unable to look me in the eyes. His clothes were soaked, his hands trembled, and his shoulders were bent under a weight heavier than any I had ever carried for him. Pride had finally knelt before consequence. He fell to his knees on the wet ground without a word. The same hands that had shoved me now pressed against the dirt, shaking, uncertain. His face was pale, his eyes wide, not with arrogance but with regret. The rain washed down his face, mixing with the tears he no longer tried to hide. The man who once laughed at my pain now felt the same cold I had felt on the floor that night. Life has a way of returning every moment, and it had returned this one perfectly. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just watched. There was no joy in it, no satisfaction. What I saw wasn't victory. It was balance. The world had corrected itself, and it had done so without my help. The silence between us was louder than any words could be. He looked up at me once, and in that look was everything: shame, fear, apology, and memory. I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once held my hand. But that boy had been lost long ago, and this man was now learning what it means to fall. He stayed there in the rain for a long time. The neighbors saw. Some watched from their windows, whispering quietly. The same people who had once whispered about my humiliation were now witnessing his. The circle had closed. He was living the lesson he had written for himself. His pride had cracked open, and from it poured the realization of everything he had done wrong. Every word he had said, every laugh he had thrown, every push, every insult, it all came back to him in the sound of rain hitting the ground. I didn't reach out to lift him. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew this was the moment he needed to face alone. Some lessons cannot be softened. They must be felt in full, through the same pain they once caused. The ground beneath him was the same kind I had hit, cold, wet, unyielding. I wanted him to remember it for the rest of his life, not to fear me, but to fear the arrogance that had brought him there. After a while, he stood up slowly, weak, unsteady, and silent. He didn't look at me again. He turned and walked away through the rain, his steps heavy, his back bent. The street swallowed him in gray mist, and then he was gone. I closed the door quietly and went back to my chair. The rain kept falling, steady and calm. The silence inside my house felt warm. Justice had arrived, not through anger or violence, but through truth. That night, I sat in the dark, listening to the sound of rain on the roof. I didn't think about revenge anymore. I thought about peace, the kind that comes when a man stands up not to strike back, but to finally stop bending. The man who once made me fall had finally knelt. The balance was complete. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but its traces remained everywhere. Puddles on the road, damp leaves on the ground, and the faint smell of earth rising through the air. I stepped outside and saw the sky clearing, a pale light cutting through the clouds. Everything looked washed clean, as if the world had quietly reset itself. I felt the same inside. The storm that had followed me for months was finally gone. I didn't feel anger anymore, only stillness. The man who once laughed at my pain had walked away in silence, and that silence was my victory. News spreads fast in small places. By noon, everyone knew. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back now spoke softly, almost respectfully. They had seen him kneel in the rain. They had watched the proud man become small. Some came to my gate, pretending to check in on me, but I could see curiosity in their eyes. I didn't tell them anything. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken without words. People respect silence more than speeches. When you let the world witness consequence instead of revenge, it understands in its own way. His wife left soon after. She couldn't bear the change. Pride can hold a marriage together when there's money and status, but it disappears when both are gone. I heard she packed her things quietly and didn't look back. Friends who once praised him vanished too. They stopped answering his calls, stopped visiting, stopped laughing with him. The same crowd that once fueled his arrogance now avoided his shadow. He was alone, the way I had once been. But for me, solitude had been peace. For him, it was punishment. Weeks passed. The whispers died down, but the memory remained. People forgot the details, but they remembered the lesson, that pride breaks even the strongest roof when it's built on disrespect. Sometimes, I saw him from a distance, walking with slow steps, his head lowered, his clothes plain. He had changed. The man who once shouted now moved like someone learning to breathe again. I never called to him. I didn't need to. Life had already done what I could not. It had taken his pride and left him with truth. At home, my days became quiet again. I swept the porch every morning, watered the plants, and cooked my meals in peace. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Every wall, every chair, every inch of space carried dignity again. I had no one to share my meals with, but I no longer felt lonely. I had learned that loneliness and peace are not the same thing. Loneliness hurts when you expect someone to return. Peace heals when you no longer need them to. Sometimes at night, I thought about him, not with hatred, but with a strange sadness. I remembered the little boy who used to follow me around, holding my hand, asking questions, laughing at small things. That boy was gone, but maybe, deep down, a part of him was still there. Maybe the man who had fallen to his knees was learning how to find him again. Life teaches through pain, and the lesson he had received was one he would never forget. The world outside my home kept moving, children playing, shopkeepers shouting, people living. But I lived differently now. I spoke less, moved slower, and saw things with new eyes. I realized that every man reaches a point where he must decide what peace means. For me, it meant silence. For him, it meant surrender. When I closed my eyes at night, I no longer saw the floor or the fall. I saw rain washing over a man on his knees, and I knew that balance had returned. The past didn't haunt me anymore. The humiliation no longer hurt. Everything that needed to be said had been said by consequence itself. The man who once made me small was now small himself, and the old man who once lay broken on the floor now stood tall, not with strength, but with peace. He once pushed me to the floor and laughed. Now he walks alone, quiet and humble. I didn't destroy him. I simply stepped aside and let life show him what he truly was. I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I didn't curse. I used silence, patience, and truth, the only weapons that never miss. He had built his pride on the back of my forgiveness. When I finally stopped forgiving, the weight of his own actions crushed him. The same world that once clapped for his arrogance now looks away from his shame. And I watch it all from peace, not revenge. My house feels calm again. The walls that once echoed humiliation now breathe quiet dignity. The mornings arrive with sunlight instead of worry. The nights pass without the sound of regret. Every small sound, the kettle boiling, the chair creaking, the rain tapping against the window, feels like proof that balance has returned. I don't wait for anyone anymore. I don't expect apologies. The lesson has already been written in the space between us. He knows what he did, and I know I survived it. That's enough. People still ask me if I forgive him. I always stay silent. Forgiveness doesn't need words. It's in the way I live now, without anger, without burden, without looking back. I forgave him the moment he knelt, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. His apology was not his freedom. It was mine. Watching him fall was not victory, it was closure. I had spent my whole life standing for him. When he pushed me, I finally learned to stand for myself. Sometimes I think about how small the moment was that changed everything. One shove, one laugh, one act of cruelty that revealed a lifetime of truth. Pain has a strange way of teaching us what words never can. That single moment showed me who he truly was. And more importantly, who I had become. I had let love blind me. I had mistaken silence for peace, sacrifice for duty, patience for weakness. But falling to that floor taught me something no book or sermon could, that a father's love is strong, but it must also be firm. He lives differently now. I've heard he works quietly, keeps to himself, avoids crowds. He doesn't brag anymore. He doesn't laugh the same. Maybe he finally understands that respect is not inherited. It's earned every day. Maybe the rain that washed him that night also washed away the pride that ruined him. I don't need to know. The world has its way of finishing what we start, and I've seen enough to trust it. In my heart, there's no bitterness left, just stillness, just truth. I don't hate him. I just stopped carrying him. He pushed me down, but that fall lifted me higher than I had ever been. I rose with dignity, and that was worth more than any apology. He knelt because he needed forgiveness. I stood because I had already found mine. Final thought. He made me fall once, but I made him kneel forever. I didn't raise my voice. I raised the lesson. I didn't strike him. I let life do it for me. He learned that power is temporary, pride is fragile, and disrespect always finds its way home. In the end, he took my fall, and I took my peace.